Hello everyone, glad that you are back. I'm very pleased to have now to introduce three great artists, scholars or artist groups who will have now a talk, and before that there'll be a lecture by Jens Hauser. So we'll start with the lecture by Jens Hauser, then we'll move on to a short introduction of the practice from and by Špela Petrič, and afterwards we'll have a conversation with Jens Hauser, Špela Petrič, and Aliens in Green. And just a small introduction of Jens Hauser. Jens Hauser is a media theorist and art curator focusing on the interweaving of art and biotechnology, as well as genre-spanning and contextual aesthetics. Hauser is a researcher at the University of Copenhagen's Medical Museum and the Art Science Chair at the École Polytechnique Paris-Saclay, and distinguished affiliate faculty at Michigan State University, where he co-directs the Bridge Art Program. He's a faculty member at the Department of Image Science at the Danube University Krems, Austria, as well as a guest professor at the University of Applied Arts, Vienna. He has curated about 20 exhibitions and festivals, including L'Art Biotech in Nantes, SK Interfaces in Liverpool and Luxembourg, Synth Ethic in Vienna, Wetware in LA, and Matters in Lansing. And we are very happy also to have him back in the Ruhr area, because he has also been working at the Ruhr University in Bochum. And he was his works were very inspiring for us when we put together this whole program, so I'm very much looking forward to it, and I'd like you to give a warm welcome to Jens Hauser.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's nice to be back to the Ruhr. And I really find the festival fascinating in its attitude, and it overlaps a lot with the practices that we are discussing not only in this panel, but have been very prominently coming into place a little bit worldwide when decentering the plane of anthropocentrism. And it's very easy to say, hello everybody. It's a common phrase to say, and nobody really thinks of what does this everybody mean. Do we really address everybody? Do we really address ladies, gentlemen, trans and interstill humans, people or animals, dear insects, welcome, everybody, plants, protists, fungi, bacteria, algae, virus, and so on. So in how far, what do we mean by everybody? So the title of my short introduction to this panel is Microperformativity and Biomediality. So as Klaas said, we have a lecture, and then of course very much related to the aspects raised, a presentation by Špela Petrič and by Aliens in Green. So both personally in my academic research and curatorial practice, I am concerned with how humankind is having this drive to compensate culturally for the increasing technical manipulation of living systems. And I study how artists, philosophers, nature scientists, engineers shape both our world and then shape the according metaphors that we are happy to live by, how we as a human species symbolically hyper and overcompensate for indeed material bio and necropolitics. So on the one hand, I have a particular interest also in performance art and dance, and filmed and documented many pieces when I was still a cultural journalist, and then programmed them also as a festival organizer. So I have two key terms here, which are microperformativity and biomediality, that result as this kind of working tools out of these practices since the year 2003. So, yes. First, the term microperformativity, as I have employed it over the last years, has been coined to emphasize the recent attention paid to other than human agencies, biological and technological ones, and is meant to challenge and subvert this mesoscopic tradition within which human phenomenology is still rooted. And in times where performance art, which is very much at the core of this festival, which mainly involved human bodies, shifts more generally into a scope of pervasive performativity in art, artists and performers redefine what actually is considered a body. So they displace the focus from its mesoscopic actions, movements and so on, usually of a human body, to its microscopic functions, when gene or cell fragments, proteins, enzymes, etc. are employed to act as identity proxies or to stage non-human agents in relation to performative techno-scientific systems. So microperformativity, as I see it, shifts the attention from physical gestures to physiological processes. It also contrasts stage diegetic narrative time, theater time, with real biological time, or the performative time of an experiment. So the term takes all its sense, I believe, in contemporary artistic strategies, and the interest in microbiome research, for example, or in synthetic biology, where gene and cell fragments, proteins, enzymes, bacteria, and viruses are employed. And on the other hand, while on the other, science and technology studies increasingly ascribe agency to experimental technical systems as well, and question the human scale as a crucial reference point. So such techno-science-inspired art practice that material-involved biotechnologies aim at increasing awareness for the invisibility of the microscopic and for the incomprehensibility of the macroscopic on the other side. So they participate in alternative knowledge production within what can be identified both as a performative and also an epistemological turn in the arts. It's very interesting that within this 2003 exhibition in Nantes in 2000, in the Lieu Unique in the National Art Center in Nantes, there has been for the first time a kind of link between biomedia art and performance art, and it was not seen that way at this time. Just Disembodied Cuisine was one of the commissioned pieces by the Tissue Culture and Art Project at this time, and it consisted in growing in specifically constructed bioreactors in microgravitable conditions, victimless frog steaks as three-dimensional edible cultures without animal victim. And it was a very interesting experience throughout the exhibition. So the artists were actually doing a performance of feeding both the cells, but at the same time both the frogs that after the exhibition closed were released unharmed into the botanical garden, while we have been eating parts of these. And there was a performance to feed both the cells and the frogs. And finally, people came in and really saw this performance every day and wanted to assist. And gallery personnel told me, "Oh, this is strange. He's coming back every day. You know, he wants to know if the frog steaks are doing all right." Right? So there was this performativity aspect in it that we have not been talking about much in the 2000s that early. So it was very striking to see that in his book. Aliveness from Adrian Heathfield. It was a catalogue around an action he did at the Tate Modern Gallery in London at this time. And he was integrating for the first time biotechnical arts in the performative programming. And he displaced in this book and in this festival performance art in this direction. So, of course, sculpture, as he said, was performing, the object became alive, but also more and more affective works emerged between sculpture, installation, live arts, and now the aesthetic practices played with the borders of life and death, the human and the animal, the theatrical and the elemental, and there was this drive to life, towards the immediate, to the obsession of liveness, where attention is heightened and sensory relation charged. And also he highlighted this disruptive potential that it has with regards to the impact that live arts, presence and not representation has. And he also insisted on something that is very crucial to the debate we have been having here about the economical relationships in performativity and the consequences of capitalized life. So Hirschfeld points out that the scrutiny that this performance art brings to temporality has a significance in the accelerated cultures of late capitalism, because time has become a commodity that is highly regulated, and speed is a prime value, and time wasted is money lost. And here, deploying a contemplative, wasteful experience of time, performance continues as its wrangle with the forces of capital. Finally, Hirschfeld also concludes in the scope of significant new performative practices, precisely a work I commissioned for the show La Biotech, so the disembodied in cuisine. And the argument is that bare life, so zoe and not bios only, is staged here in new experience at the borders of art and technology. So we witness here is a shift from in the performative arts from life with a V to life with an F. Likewise, I tried to articulate this shift and to sketch out a kind of performative value in biotechnological arts in 2006 for an article by Performance Journal. And I tried to bring forth this question: what happens when artists choose performative, diegetic forms of presentation that display biotechnologies in relation to their philosophical, political, and economical parameters? So the underlying dialectical relationship between actual presence and representation is, I think, comparable to that of performance. While the theatrical actor metaphorically embodies a role, the performer contributes his or her own body, identity, and biography. And similarly, the observer of so-called bioart must shift between the symbolic artistic space and the real life, in very little biological terms, of the presented process suggested by organic presence. So these processes also draw their significance not only as semiotic, cultural, human science, but through their own performativity, which suggests the recipient has an existential experience of bodily co-presence through the materiality of the presentation. So this prompts, of course, the question and further problems of definition what the broader spectrum of live art and performance, visual arts, and much beyond are. What is a body to be choreographed today, for example? And both notions, what a body is and what a choreography can be, needs to be questioned and redefined. So we need to deal with bodies beyond human bodies, of course, and also choreography beyond dance. And a body, a corpus, in Latin is first and almost defined as organized physical substance, a mass of matter, distinct from other masses, a physical entity, but its scale and nature has nothing anthropomorphic as such. And choreography, of course, from the Latinized word or the form of Greek chorea, dance, and graphia, written form, denotes quite broadly and neutrally the art of creating and arranging sequences of movement that are perceived as alive, hence also the French spectacle vivant, for example. So there's an attempt to escape the scale represented in this famous Leonardo drawing of the Vitruvian Man, in which the workings of the human body are related to ideal proportions, valid for all kinds of analogies in architecture or beyond at the universe at large. So, however, this straightforward anthropocentrism has come under critical and humorous scrutiny, subverting this Vitruvian Man in the light of other metrics and logics that are molecular or microbial. Such representation question the human scale as a main reference point and can be seen as an illustration also of the three allowed wounds to human narcissism, die drei Kränkungen, that are earlier described by Sigmund Freud. So first of all, we remember Copernicus' discovery of heliocentrism as a first blow to humanity's narcissism and a critique to centralism as such. Second, Darwin, who regulated the anthropos just to a descent from the animal world. And third, Freud's psychological explanations where the human ego is not even master in his own house anymore. And where today even bacteria are said to be influencing cognition and emotion in microbiome studies. So the notion of microperformativity may aptly describe then the shift in scale towards molecules, cells, proteins, bacteria, viruses, etc., to subvert this automatism in which humans and its arts considerations are centered. Despite the manifold technical media that made it possible to extend these scales in time and space in both directions. And try to come to grips with this macroscopic on the one side and the related microscopic dimensions beyond organisms. And this is being done by increasingly considering the functions of microscopic bodies beyond just the actions of the mesoscopic human body. But it is difficult to come to grips with anthropomorphization. Nina Scegledi and Raymond Guardians have mapped that artists, even confronted with extreme environments, make in general very poor use of this large scope that is opened up by media technologies and scientific tools. Most works are still concentrated in the outcomes in the small bubble, with, of course, the human scale as a reference point in the middle. So these different scales indeed offering artistic potential within the organic realm of carbon-based living systems, as well as within the realm of the inanimate physical microscopic and macroscopic extremes from which the organic can emerge, between simple chemical self-replication systems or extremophile life forms that are studied in astrobiology. So on each of these scales, we can imagine that different patterns can be picked for artistic interventions. And in view of biotechnological methods now available largely to art, new prospects for the staging of co-corporality with a continuum of life emerge, extending the notion of agency beyond the range of human actions and the potentials of animal, plant life, bacterial, viral agency, but also the material media, experimental systems often screened out. Yes. So in the light of multi-species salons that are organized, not only animal but also plant alterity, with plants as persons to which equivalent capacities of sentience and mentality are being ascribed, let's agree with Monika Backe that there is a new need for zoontologies, microontologies, and vegetal anti-metaphysics to reconsider traditionally understood species boundaries and to re-examine the messy contact zones between zomas in the framework of the reality of messy trans-species entanglements. It indeed merits discussion in how far such developments towards microperformative agencies and macroscopic trans-species ecologies really trigger post-anthropocentric worldviews, and whether the deconstruction of the human-centered plane is in a desired achievement. In art and cultural theory, especially conservative thinkers have been fighting vigorously against any kind of loss of the center, atomization or molekularization. As an example, in Art and Crisis, Hans Sedlmayr in 1958 argued precisely that the lost center, in German der Verlust der Mitte, as a human figure of the image of God, is responsible for the disturbed relationship humankind has with spirituality, nature, and time and itself. He says that art strives away from the center and becomes, in the very sense of the word, eccentric. The human does not feel itself the crown of creation anymore as a master and center of nature. We can see everywhere a tendency towards the extremes, a polarization. It is noticeable that art tends, since the French Revolution, to scatter opposites until their very irreconcilability. It is worth noting that also Sedlmayr was a Nazi sympathizer. But even less conservative voices, such as Adorno and Horkheimer, in their Dialectic of Enlightenment, Dialektik der Aufklärung, criticize the degree of abstraction from the human center, initiated by the Enlightenment. Quote, each human being has been endowed with a self and of his or her own, different from all others, so that it could all the more surely be made the same. Abstraction, which is the instrument of enlightenment, stands in the same relationship to its objects as fate, whose concept it eradicates, as liquidation. Okay, so Adorno and Horkheimer then strangely and disturbingly resonate with Chilean biologist and philosopher Humberto Maturana. In a much overlooked quote, Maturana writes, I'm part of the human carcinoma, which destroys the earth, like a cellular cancer destroys the organism that allows it to live. Cancer is cell growth that propagates with total operational indifference or disregard of what is happening with the other cells of the organism. So we are, as human beings, in the blind focus on continued population growth in operational difference or disregard of what is happening with the other creatures of the world, the cancer that destroys the earth. So how to avoid the traps of decentering and post-anthropomorphizing without falling into the trap of primitive biologisms? Maturana goes on. Cancer cells, however, do not exist in language and do not reflect. They cannot reflect on what is happening as a consequence of their continuous reproduction. But human beings indeed exist through language, and we can reflect by thinking. We can become aware of what's happening by our actions, so we can act responsibly. So therefore, when addressing microperformativity, the naive use and reference to gene and cell fragments, proteins, bacteria itself, or just as identity proxies should be avoided. And in this sense, the interdisciplinary character of performativity as such is worth to be highlighted. It marks, above all, a shift from the representational idiom to a performative idiom, and intending to put the focus of the processuality of knowledge, the knowing what, and not on the results of knowledge, the knowing how, the knowing that. And this opens the view for the interplay of human and non-human actors and agents. I want to agree with Chris Salter that performativity itself needs to be understood as a technical cultural hybrid form. Tracing it back to the early 20th century, his book Entangled: Technology and the Transformation of Performance shows that performative forms and the fascination of the machinic had gone hand in hand, but that since the 20th century, the long history of technological entanglement with performance practice has been ignored or downplayed, not only in theater and dance histories or post-dramaturgy, but also in the recent search about writing about new media. Before the notion appeared in the techno-scientific context itself by shifting from performance art or performance as object of inquiry to performativity as method of inquiry. And according to this analysis, four main developments become entangled. First, in linguistics, of course, in speech act theory, Austin described the idea that the performative expression or utterance does not just describe an action in language, but actually performs or activates something. So in How to Do Things with Words, Austin, as we know, suggests that non-descriptive language does not just represent statements, but it is an inherently material practice in the way it can change the course of an event in the world and create a new one. Then, of course, with the upcoming gender studies, the performative program as pursued by cultural theorists such as Judith Butler and so on examines the political dimension and notion that the materiality of the human body is in its gendering is not ontologically pre-given as a fixed essence in a fixed human subject, but instead performatively produced in and over time. In parallel, the performative turn in anthropology and sociology, mainly under the influence of anthropologist Victor Witter-Turner and theater director Richard Schechner, further transformed the previous concept of performance as a subject of research into the performative as a technique of self-reflection, as a method by which research would be conducted. And the fourth part is, of course, in the sociology of science, or STS, the performative program is extended to the analysis of knowledge production laboratories. So it takes into account the role of technocultural hybrids, experimental systems, the agency of non-human systems in what French anthropologist Bruno Latour called human and non-human collectives, displacing humans as the sole producers of knowledge, the expressors of agency. So all these examples imply that performativity is no longer confiscated in the human-centric tradition, just denoting the capacity of an agent to act in the world. And it is here where the concepts of microperformativity and biomediality overlap in the space between life, with its actions and functions, and technical media, especially given the progressive convergence what we have today of hard, soft, and wetware. So biomediality then defines all topical and functional enabling factors that arise as a result of the organization of living organisms and biotechnological processes, be they technically manipulated or just appropriated to be made usable. So its principles can be understood as a form of loose coupling, lose Kopplung, of de- and reorganized biological entities, such as nucleotides, cells, bacteria, or lab organisms, that, despite their own vital potential, are indeed conceived as indifferent vis-à-vis what they mediate. So in fact, they do not mediate something, they are something but themselves, but they give the bodies to mediate something else. So the point of departure of this atomistic principle of loosely coupled independent units that, according to earlier media philosophy by Fritz Heider from the 1920s, make media functions possible, such as transmission, mediation, processing, and the perception. But such atomism, however, differentiates itself from media understood physically only, in that organisms are, as a central point of reference, are or were organized. So biomediality then demonstrates how media functions, based on physical or electronic principles, can be shifted towards bio and convergent technologies, but conserving existing media functions and adding others, novel capacities such as self-repair, adopt, evolve, and in the organic realm. So they expand the triad of media based on physical laws to store, to transmit, and to process. And they can, in this sense, be defined as organized atomism. So it's worth insisting how much current definitions, dominated by communication studies, have actually impoverished the very focus of mediality. As media historian Erik Porath reminds us, the word medium in the 17th century, in the translation from Latin into modern European languages, was used more frequently in the context of the natural than of the human science, before it was then, in the second half of the 18th century, superimposed by connotations through the broader understanding of a medium as just an intermediary element, and more generally as a means or as a tool, while, quote, the earlier natural scientific meaning of medium, and precisely in the sense of an element, as a carrier of physical and chemical processes, constitutes a central criterion for a materiality of media. The focus on functions of communication causes us, quote again, to lose sight of the natural scientific relevance of mediality, so that cultural studies and traditional media studies approaches lack consideration of natural science and its history. When you ask a cell biologist today, even today, please bring your medium, it is most likely that he will not turn up in company with a visionary shaman, nor with a television, but with a flask of nutrient solution, which is his culture medium. And there is a relation, of course, through etymology, such as outlined by Leo Spitzer in his very early 1942 article, Milieu and Ambience, an essay on historical semantics. He actually is describing how the milieu, the term passes over into the vocabulary of the biologist, and then it becomes enriched. And the second step from biology to sociology, and then also between natural science and social science were dissolved. And this is something where new media art practices, increasingly since the 90s, that employ a broad spectrum of methods from the life science, are situated well to serve as epistemic indicators of how the very concept of what a medium is have changed. Just to take three categories I'm trying to describe. I've described this since the 2000s as instances of biomediality in three different dimensions. So biological media, biomedia, and media of biology. So biological media could be understood as media in the sense of milieu, as an existential milieu that turn biological systems into something, that surround a body and enable its internal functions. So technically that would be, for example, experimental systems with incubators, flasks, and growth vessels where milieus are simulated, technically, for example, in tissue culture. And this notion of the medium has been skipped very often in communication science. Biomedia then would be media as transformative generative means, tools whereby biological systems do something. They are biofictional bodies outside the parameter of their initial purpose. So they are processing bodies, molecules, organisms, populations that can synthesize gene sequences, the use of viral promoters, or the programming of cells as synthesis factories, or also bioinformatics or biocomputing. And the third one would be something we have been also experiencing in the workshop, because media of biology are then employed to measure, analyze, to observe media that do something with other biological systems. So in which one organic system reveals something about another one, not just measuring with physics, but where one organism is measuring the other. So it can be viewed historically in the tradition of microscopy and cell scintigraphy, but also today are fluorescent biomarkers, biosensors, DNA chips, or gel electrophoresis. The first category is easy, just illustrated by this example by the tissue culture and art project. Again, there is a kind of production of a milieu. There is no intervention in the nucleus. There's nothing happening on the genetic level. It's growing cells in a kind of techno-scientific body by simulating a new milieu. The second example would be, for example, Joe Davis' bacterial radio using a genetically modified sequence from this marine puffball sponges in order to actually plate silicate to plate radio circuits to actually run bacteria and to make the bacteria, the transgenic bacteria, construct a kind of primitive crystal radio that would transmit or store information. And the third one would be to measure, how to do measuring of one organism through the other one, which is what Paul Vanous does in his gel electrophoresis devices, where enzymes, as scissors, are actually cutting DNA. So it's not hard scissors, it's not metal, it's not just electronics, it's a very chemical, biochemical interplay that is making these functions possible. So we see that artists then purposefully link instances of biomediality with pre-existing medias, with photography, with text, with mass communication, with interactivity, and as a consequence, transform and expand the very concept of media. The influence of biology and technologies applied to it have been very crucial in the last 20 years. When Friedrich Kittler, since in his canonical definition, deals with transmission, storage, and processing of information, of course, we can apply all this also to the biological realm and its metaphors. DNA is often used in place of traditional storage media to store extra biological data, and the paradigm of information transmission is compared to capacities, for example, of viruses and messenger RNA, and the concept of processing parallels natural protein biosynthesis or instrumental biotechnologies, such as DNA computing. And in the milieu of biohacking and DIY, biologic wetwork corners are set up in already existing hackerspaces very often, anchored in the paradigm of computer and counterculture, tactical media hacktivism, pursuing appropriation strategies as a forerunners such as Super 8 film clubs, video groups, or local open access TV channels. It's worth noting and considering how these media then produce what they pretend only to mediate. And this is how we can explain what initially appears to be a very paradox, that, for example, artists operate simultaneously with the fascination of immediately alive art, but second, with the fascination of biotechnological operations that manipulate the living. It's very interesting to see this, for example, in bacterial turn. A good indicator of these microperformative qualities is, for example, to look at art projects throughout the last 20 or 30 years, where artists have been doing in a very different way, operating with bacterial as biological means. And, for example, bacteria can be milieus, they can be technical means, and they can also be bioindicators, instances of measuring. They can be anything. They can be symbolic proxies of aliveness, movie actors, living pigments, cleaners, healers, destroyers, preservators of cultural heritage, There can be evolutionary indicators. There can be learning biosymbiotic organisms. There can be time capsules for life suspended animation. There can be unspecified bacterial flora, a vital milieu, and so on and so on. So just 2-3 examples. In the 90s, for example, bacteria just were employed but overlooked. In Wim Delvoye's digestive machines, branded cloacas, where functional metabolic processes between enzymes and gut bacteria are enacted to produce excrement, it's a very performative installation because visitors often applaud when the droppings fall, right? But all the attention here is directed to the enzymes and the digested food in this biocybernetic puppet theater. But the bacteria necessary for this mimicked biological process of a gut is just being addressed as bacterial flora, very abstract, so as a milieu. Then, later, artistic practices focus on what bacteria can actually do, on their technical, their innate capacities. Here in Edgar Lissel's work, for example, he is using bacteria that normally biodeteriorate to actually bioremediate. So actually employing bacteria, cyanobacteria, which move to light sources and that can be found in the Domus Aurea caves in Rome where they degrade the frescoes. So Lissel then teaches the bacteria to reconstruct what they destroyed by shining a negative of a photo taken from the frescoes onto an equally large plate with growth media, and the bacteria then move towards the light and with their pigments reconstitute a copy of the destroyed wall painting. Or in Adam Brown's work, the great work of the metal lover, here extremophile bacteria that are also used as indicators or to clean industrially polluted soils become protagonists, the very stars of turning waste into gold. And these extremophiles possess the technical capacity to metabolize heavy metals. And here they produce 24-karat golds, harvested then to create little nuggets and seemingly solving the alchemist riddle of the philosopher's stone. A last example here for Klaas and Lucy Strecker. In her live performance Hare's Blood, a molecular animal has been engineered in the form of an artistic biobrick, which is a standardized genetic sequence spliced then into bacteria or fungi. And this incorporates gene sequences isolated from the blood of the famous Joseph Beuys hair performance, and turning the politically engaged happening from the artist from the 70s, utopia of an equitable counter-economy, upside down, in the light of the current speculation into bioparts. So this transgenic post-Beuys creature then was put up for a public auction to act as an eco-political agent whose life is now being governed by the commercial interest and the auction's attendees. So you can actually speculate on the sequences of Hare's Blood from Joseph Beuys. So most recently, last year, we collaborated to explore the notion of microperformativity at the Unsplit Festival in Munich, as well as the Applied Microperformativity Festival at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, focusing precisely on post-anthropocentric notions of performativity, not solely as a tool to describe scales of times and space, but to critically engage with socio-economic relationships inherent to the capitalist economy. Among others, Spies and Strecker conducted microbial keywording by teaching microorganisms to distinguish between real and fake relationships and ultimately transform into a homeopathic drug. So for doing this, keywords of academic lectures were repeated to produce varieties in the pH level of the speaker's saliva, which is then used via added pheromones to train the microbe's ability to distinguish between simulated sexuality and pornography and real sexuality. The resulting microbes then populate a suppository in the form of a probiotic drug to be used in fecal transplantation, meant to enhance the patient's social anti-capitalist behavior. So living money as a pharmacon implying real physical change instead of money-based abstract values. So you can actually take the discourse, make it transforming by microbes, and to put it up into your ass to act onto the brain. So it's a nice coincidence that today, precisely today, we are calling for papers for the special issue on microperformativity with performance research in 2020. So you may take this as an invitation here all together to submit a contribution to this, which certainly resonates very much with the topics here at stake at the Blue Skies Festival. So we invite everybody before the 2nd of September to write us just 1 page, and if you want to participate in this special issue on microperformativity. So, as a kind of conclusion before we continue with 2 exemplifying artistic strategies, we can say that while the techno-science today have become themselves producers of images, very powerful images, the discussed artistic strategies here call for an analysis that is not based on the image. It's based on the material media. It's based on the epistemic connections. So phenomena that once assumed the form of artistic images, sculpture, theater, narration, are being translated, scattered, fragmented into a very large variety of medialities, and which are fully integrated elements of the aesthetic object, including these biomedial aesthetic strategies and settings that become the theater of microperformativity. So as we've seen with the history of performance art and performativity as a concept, the paradigm shift brought about first by the linguistic, the performative, the pictorial turns. Now we have an epistemological turn that emerges, and art here is no merely connected and concerned with the aesthetic transposition of knowledge, but of knowing and feeling how knowledge is actually produced. And this is, I think, a very nice transition to actually Špela Petrič, and we would like to welcome Špela Petrič for her input to this panel right now. Please welcome Špela Petrič. So Špela Petrič, and also we have 2 contributions to this panel. Špela Petrič is a Slovenian artist, also a PhD holder in biology, and is also awarded right now and at the Ars Electronica Festival by the Award of Distinction for a very particular intriguing work that is working on confronting vegetal otherness. It's a triptychon that you are going to explain a little bit, and we have, of course, examples of your work here. And the second part will be, of course, on Aliens in Green, where the performative space has just visited, has had his last visitors this morning. So, Špela.
Thank you very much, Jens.
How do you think that this relates to each other?
Yeah, you can hear me, right? Yes. Okay. Very much, actually, especially this last part of your talk overlaps very much, maybe too much, with my thoughts. So yeah, I just kind of prepared a text in 2 segments to, as concisely as possible, guide you through some of the thoughts that led to the artwork Ectogenesis, Plant-Human Monsters, that is on display there, if you haven't seen it, as well as how it connects to the Aliens in Green Xenopolitics performance workshop. Yeah, so the opus that Jens was mentioning is called Confronting Vegetal Otherness, and I initially conceived it to explore this strange relationship with vegetal beings that are very much ignored at different levels of scale. Because I realized that actually if we relate to plants on the cellular or molecular scale, for example, if we have a plant in culture and human cells in culture, we don't see such a drastic difference between the 2 types of entities. There's a lot of conflict when it comes to this human individual, which we have associated so many conceptions with. Whereas then finally, when we look at a deep time and more societal relationship, the boundaries and also who is in charge of whom gets completely blurred. So it's already offering its own subversion of our anthropocentric view. So I'll just briefly mention this work, Scotopoiesis, which actually performs the human gesture of insisting to be noticed by these plants. I stood in front of germinating cress for 20 hours, acting as the object in the plant's perception by casting a shadow onto them. Of course, the plants not only are sort of deprived of light to photosynthesize, but the shadow itself is a signal to them to change the morphology. And these are the cress plants. They grow very fast, which is why I chose them to perform it in this relationship. So this is the result. You sort of see this, you know, we're always desiring this proof, and this was the proof that intercognition happens. I myself was observing the plants, but the plants were clearly observing me. Otherwise, how could have they changed in such a way? And yet, precisely what this plant is, or what the plants are, remains inaccessible to me, and you know, vice versa. But right now, I'd like to go a bit more in depth into the work ectogenesis or phytoteratology, which is the other title. So the aim was to procreate phytopollutants, so phyto plants obviously, and pollutan in Slovene actually means mongrel. And because in English it sounds like pollution, I thought that was a fitting name for them, phytopollutants. So plant monsters. So for me, this was a process of breaking barriers and also reclaiming my reproductive freedom, if only within my personal and perhaps bizarre phantasm of transgression, that actually, because I was becoming the mother of, or I engaged with plants, this isn't quite as problematic if I were doing this with some furry animal. But I did hope to experience this strange proximity in this unusual situation with the tail cress, an intimacy that would penetrate the perceived distance between us. So those of you who were not in the introductory talk, basically I was making plant-human monsters by taking tail cress cells and incubating them in an environment filled with hormones that I extracted from my urine. So within the semiosphere, hormones are molecular signs that are interpreted by cells. And the steroid hormones that run through my human body to synchronize metabolic processes, growth, and sexual cycles are actually the same ones, identical to the ones traversing the body of the tail cress, but the plant will understand them differently. As plants also have other signaling molecules, perhaps that are more prominent, more classical plant hormones, but they also have progesterone, estrogen, testosterone. So these molecules materially connect our molecular cognition and recall the evolutionary moment when our bodies went their separate ways, nevertheless vowing to stay close and to stay existentially dependent on each other, which is basically the basis of our coexistence. We are able to perceive one another, and this completely erases any perceived boundary between human and the other than human. In a way, we only have epistemological and an ontological problem, while the transgression, I mean, the boundary never really existed. So in ectogenesis, steroid hormones became the molecular bridge between the tail cress and myself. But to be convinced and convincing as to the effect, like we had before in scotopoiesis, here I had to call forth a third partner, one who has already shaped the contours of much of the cultural landscape we inhabit, and this is scientific epistemology and its biotechnological capacity that then framed our plant-human relationships as an authentic exchange. So that is the proof. So our intimacy, in a way, was performed first in the realm of abstract sex. That is what legitimizes it, right? The fact that I say to you, but no, plants also have these hormones, right? That is this scientific observation. The phenomenological gap between the nanoscale molecular processes and our human mesoscale sensorial apparatus was filled in by the scientific imaginary that I had learned to navigate over the past 20 years. So basically, this is my original field of study, right? This is what comes naturally to me. The phytopollutants are situated there in this hyper-real virtuality of scientific schemata and their PowerPoint box and arrow aesthetic. The phytopollutants' monstrous bodies attest to the sunken place beneath our microscopic encounters, the access to which is granted through a rite of passage that dissects fragments and recomposes. So I think this is really important, that in order to be able to understand the scientific knowledge that is brought to the table, you have to accept it, first of all. So I think this kind of creates a gap. And it's not only about scientific literacy, right? It's really being able to accept this as a worldview. So how did this process happen? I collected urine in the mornings and I isolated my sex hormones from it using a process called chromatography, and those that were part of the Aliens in Green workshop did actually perform the same process. With the separation of the complex mix of information and nutrition contained in my pee, I could prepare a dark yellow essential extract of pure messaging molecules that the baby tail cress would be surrounded with in the artificial womb. And it started with 11-day-old tail cress embryos taken from their seed pods and then placed in the sterile glass on a jellified medium. And after 2 weeks, single cells developed into embryos. And there were many embryos, so this is called somatic embryogenesis. So you do not need an egg and a sperm, or like an egg cell and a pollen, but the embryos emerge from body cells, from this callus. So plants are much more plastic, and you can more easily make them create these somatic embryos. So small embryos were popping into life, and they were smooth and torpedo-shaped. You can observe some of them. Maybe there's still some that are in this form. They have been informed as much through their own vital principle as the hormonally doped environment I placed them in. Because their every cell division was bombarded by the mutual feedback between biology and technology. And thus, the tail cress and myself were in the embrace not only of each other, but also succumbing to the imminent pervasion of mutant species, bodies, and sexes through the reductive power of molecular engineering. So there was not just 2, but really 3 partners. Like us, the phytopollutants are beings of biotechnological excess. Scientific epistemology invites the expansion of biopolitics through the erasure of any significant difference between living bodies and technology. That's precisely what you were talking about. So the abstractions of findings that are drawn from very wet and very particular entities that are often literally killed by the act of observation, then form the consensual objective reality, which is organized by the scientific disembodied we. And these narratives evoke an imaginary of machinic cells, and we're inspired over the emergence of life from very distinguishable parts. But they also create innumerable points of access into a disenchanted biology. So this act of observation invites colonization. It cannot be disentangled. So in the project Phytoteratology or Ectogenesis, the techno-scientific framework imposes the gaze of control, molecularization, and the necessity of technology to keep the plant monsters alive. And hence, the relationship between agencies, the plants and humans, in this case, me and the tail cress, is precarized, in the struggle to perform the operations of scientific methodology. both partners are subjected to the rules of the interface. Regardless of my desire for a porous becoming together with plants, which I constructed in this non-genetic essentialist, right? It was about hormones, it was about the environment, it was about reclaiming ectogenesis. Still, the aesthetic and context of techno-science dominates the work. And it begs the question if it is at all possible to employ techno-science to tell any narrative other than its own. So, if our current view on the relationship between living entities is so much imbued by science that is then complicit with techno-capitalism, how can we propose an alternative relationality if we continue to use its tools? That's an open question, and I think it was also a bit your point.
Well, a funny thing that you're referring to this new beings also as to imagine the human as a vegetariat, so
yes.
which is also relating to something we have addressed earlier as plantamorphization,
yes.
that we see in a lot of performances, that they are slowing down, that motion is replaced by something which more resembles growth, but also the very notion of a vegetariat, as you phrase it, is very interesting because it resumes also questions of the proletariat, which is also about lower class, the precarious nature of it, and also the lack of individuality. Is this on purpose?
Yeah, absolutely. The vegetariat is actually the new concept that I am now starting to develop, and it comes from all this study of plants and plant beings. And actually, I've come to, I would say, a striking conclusion, right? Because it's not so much about I don't know, fighting anthropocentrism, getting over this separation, but I came to the realization that in the eyes of the algorithm, in the eyes of biotechnology, we are all the plants. So there actually this kind of hierarchy has already been erased in many, many ways. And for me, this offers a possibility of a commoning that comes out of a need, out of an urgency, rather than sitting philosophizing, oh, it would be really nice to be together with, instead of dominating. But when we actually understand the xeno forces, well, we proclaim them as xeno powers, then it might make much more sense to try to explore the capacities of the vegetarians. And the vegetarian is not human or non-human. It is every being that has that exists in being observed, classified, quantified, modulated. You know, all this behaviorism that works somehow to organize bodies in a biopolitical present that I think is penetrating and controlling, like this surveillance capitalism to the nth potence. That is our reality now.
You earlier referred to that the plants are seeing us. I mean, this is a very interesting thing. So that actually there's a assumption that there is a comparative way of not only perception but of treating of information and the subsequent molecular pathway that is engaged by that. So this rhymes a little bit with what we have been hearing earlier this afternoon also in Emilia Sanabria's Speaking Plants talk about giving the voice to the plants, and it's about the ethics of relation and about not only the active principles of materials to be consumed by us, but in terms of the ethics of relationships. So I think there is something of giving the voice when you speak of the plants see us.
The plants see us, and in terms of this intercognition or in terms of the vegetariat?
Yeah, in terms of the intercognition.
Yes, for sure. But I would actually find it very hard to take the, I would say, moral high ground in terms of the personal relationships that you have or you might have. It's not, I think, a moment of enlightenment, but as if we're talking about performativity, it is like a way of living and caring, and it's really small gestures. And I think that there is just, if instead of having a really great thoughts about revolutionizing our societies, if instead we are satisfied with, I don't know, like making do with improvised futures, that these relationships, because we rely on the others so much for really tiny gestures, they emerge. Like the whole big question of ethics is solved through the action of the everyday life. That is kind of like my approach to not being able, because of the metaphysical construct, to come up with an ideal solution. Nor do I actually believe that ideal solutions in this day and age work, really.
You talked about the hormones, and this is bringing up to the second part of this panel. The hormones also as not only signaling substances, but actually as something to be interpreted. Where often in the cybernetic and genetic discourse, all was about information, right?
Yes.
And it was information principles that were overlapping between cybernetic and genetic discourse, and which were very prominent. Whereas even afterwards, the very focus put on interpretation and not on information is something that we very see in a field called biosemiotics, right? And you're very much interested by that. So maybe in how far do you think that the interpretant has shifted, and in how far this shift from information to interpretation is crucial, because this is obviously what is at the stake of Alliance and Green Practices as a tactical media group.
So I'll start, and then Ewan can continue. So yes, I fell in love with biosemiotics. I might be a bit less enthusiastic about it as, I don't know, a term, because it still very much remains within an academic circle that is very much constricted by science. So I think I would say that, of course, this shift to science, shift to communication, and to this semiotic freedom is highly important, because it erases also, it's another way of erasing the boundary of this logocentrism, because you see that making meaning is just completely connected with life as such. And that's the sort of the theory of emergence of life. No, it was not only about copying the information, it was about the capacity to make associations between this and that, which is this, the making of meaning. However, I think that in practice, because it comes from an understanding of language and understanding of science, it is also limited. So that's why you see a lot of things written on biosemiotics, but I think very little, I would say, comes out of that. You know, it's kind of like a dead end. It's a way of interpreting, but not really sparking this creative ways of acting.
What it maybe adds is that, for example, we had the discussion with also Marie-Louise Angerer, quoting Catherine Hale's concept of the non-conscious cognition, that cognition doesn't need to be conscious. And this is also abolishing the kind of hierarchical order that ascribes most benefits to symbolic sign relationships than to iconic, and least to indexical relationships, to say we have to put them onto the same plane. And it's not because you have the ability in cognition to be conscious and to create symbolic orders that this is by definition a hierarchical advantage. So there is something also in Jesper Hoffmeyer's writings about that, to put them on the same plane, to say there's nothing superior about symbolic connections, about iconic resemblance, but it's also the indexical is at the very same level. And maybe this is interesting when you talk about hormones, which is of course the second part of this panel, in how far hormones and endocrine disruptors, which are in fact disturbing the balance that we have in our regulatory system as human mesoscopic bodies, but indeed how these are being perturbed, how they're disrupted by chemical industry and by mimickers of our naturally existing hormones. So I would like to introduce, of course, Yvonne Chardonnay, part as yourself, as the Aliens in the Green Collective, a kind of technical theater group that is using this kind of mapping, public education, workshopology kind of based strategies to enable participants to really learn about this kind of epistemological shift. So, Evan, can you describe what Aliens in Greens do? Well, maybe you can start to describe the group. Why do you choose these practices, and how do you transpose these microperformative agencies of endocrine disruptors into a space that is still able to sense for us humans?
Thank you, Jens. Yeah, maybe I will introduce and give you some journals around. Maybe you can circulate and take a copy for you. So my name is Werner Chardonnay. I have a science journalist background, a science and art journalist background. I work with for more than 15 years with a duo of conceptual artist and graphic designer called Bureau d'études. They did a lot of maybe you've seen around mapping research projects, and we developed a collaborative research journal, artist-run journal called The Laboratory Planet. This one is issue 5, and our methodologies has been in the past to work on this very cheap format of journal as a research tool for us. So for a couple of months or a year, we tackle a topic through developing a journal, and we invite philosophers, artists, or scientists to collaborate and propose a text for a specific topic. In the past, we've been searching electromagnetic spectrum as an issue back 10 years ago, when it was an emergence of 4G and wireless technologies. We also have been researching the polar geoeconomics in the polar region against 10 years ago. We also have been searching issues around drugs in general, from all kinds of narcotics and 20th century research around narcotics. And 5-6 years ago, we started to, in the context, specifically also in the context in the Conference of Parties number 21 in Paris in 2015, to prepare an issue going through the question of the Anthropocene that was quite appealing to be everywhere at the time. So we took the assumption that the Anthropocene debates so we started with the idea that it's hardly to figure out an earthly human project. Unity leads to an extended reflection, this transformation, real agent. There is no real unity since discovery of the blue marble back in the 60s. Ecological concerns are not really unifying our planet. And so we started to see maybe there are other agents at stake. We decided to come with a kind of provocative concept called alien capitalism, also because the journal is also always playing with provocative first front page, Laboratory Planet itself, title, alien capitalism, as a provocative first page, and a subtitle, Xenopolitics of the Anthropocene. Why xenopolitics? So maybe there are other strange alien forms, or xeno meaning the other. There are maybe other forces at play. Also because we realized and we saw that the prefix xeno was used in a lot of different contexts. And you can see in the journal, from xenoeconomy, xenoeconomy being, there's an example here, computer scientist searching to design the Adam Smith invisible hand computer, maybe the invisible hand concept of capitalism, that you could design a computer that would organize or predict the behavior of the invisible hand of capitalism. So that would be xenoeconomic. Xeno-money would be also in the context of the emergence of blockchains and all the new currencies and the behavior in a distributed global computer system. So you would have xeno-money, of course, also xenobiology, a field you know a lot about. Since 2015, the emergence of new form of life that have been really explored or found or created here on Earth. And also like unknown form of life, like we call the shadow biosphere and so on. So different contexts. Yeah, I will say also xenofeminism and the question of reproductive futurities and the imagination of reproduction put in the perspective of climate change and future regeneration, and how ecology use the image of reproduction as a driving moral force for behavior regarding climate change. So in that context, our methodology, so we do a research and then we come with a, let's say, artistic practice, performative artist group, tactical theater methodology. And in that context, we also met Špela Petrič and Mary Tang, Mary Magic. Špela and Mary were also working on hormones, and we were interested in this big controversy, which is endocrine disruptor problematics being debated a lot at the European Parliament. We wanted to go unfold this controversy as a, let's say, theater of controversy, would say Bruno Latour, but with coming with a more modern version of this vision of theater of controversies. So to bring in a tactical media art methodology.
So and for those who haven't been able to participate in the workshop, because you're dealing with really micro agencies with the individuality, with ecological consequences on the other hand, and both in or macroscopic consequences both on the economic, on the oikos, both understood as ecology and economy, the householding, both in terms of what we do with our planet and with our capitalized system.
Yes.
So on the micro scale, but we meet still at these festivals where we human are still a majority of consumers. So how do you actually get your method through, and how do you actually combine the difficulty in your actual action?
I suggest, Špela, I think you are having something to describe the.
So Aliens in Green is about performing recombinations. It is both what we desire to do through the performance or the abduction, as well as our methodology, because of this molecular centrism. If we chose these hormones or hormonally active agents, but they actually guide us through like a horizontal and a vertical axis from the molecular to the political, biopolitical, ecological, and this exploration of heteronormativity and eco-heteronormativity is quite confrontational, because it has to do a lot with a sense of what is right, you know, a morality. So our hope was to abduct the participants and for quite a long time, for 3 hours, and take them on a journey where they're somehow bombarded with information as well as strange bodily experience, where they're confronted not only with a molecule from their own bodies, which you normally aren't, right? This extract, this essence, but also breaking down certain barriers, like if this heteronormativity is so obsessed with having the right genitalia, what does it mean when you, in a collective context, are somehow brought to the point where you observe your own genitalia, right? So this is a moment. So if you were
This is very interesting. I wasn't expecting when I was participating that we were talking about endocrine disruptors and to have to measure the distance between my scrotum and my anus. I wasn't expecting either that we would extract molecules from our urine and to finally mix it to drink as in a vodka with pheromones. So I mean, they're quite, bodily experiences that you are forcing or encouraging people to take. I mean, this is a very, very interesting way. Can you talk, I mean, why do you do these choices? Because it's really against the grain of what people would expect in an educational mapping project.
But this was not, I don't think it was about an educational mapping. Maybe that's just a front, right? Ewan.
Well, maybe to continue about this question of eco-heteronormativity, which is something very a driving force for me. My interest to participate in this project is, again, I take it from the general political discourse and debates we hear. Specifically in France, we had this presidential campaign. There were endocrine disruptor was a very topic discussed during the campaign, and there was always, including ecologists or activists, environmental activists, having a very heteronormative vision about what is nature. So we've been very influenced to actually develop a critique of this heteronormativity in environmental activism as well. Of course, in the xenopower forces, I mean the concentration forces, like the fusion of the companies that were also happening the last few years, like Monsanto and Bayer, Syngenta and ChemChina, DuPont and Dow, all this big trust being created. And in the performance, we categorize between which is pharma, chemical industry, agrochemical industry, petrochemical industry, to show the fusion of that and what it brings. So I would say, or maybe Špela, you have something to add about the why the question of Jens, maybe.
Well, maybe there's also people in the room that have been doing this experience and can also give witness. I don't know. Is there anybody who participated in this workshop? Does anybody want to give, I mean, his or her view, his, her, or its view?
Who was it? Sorry? Yes.
I think the idea of sharing one's pheromones was a very intense moment, very unexpected. Perhaps even more than the drinking part, because it's something that it's very intimate. You're never even really aware of your own smell in a conscious level. And then this idea of like sharing it and revealing it to others felt very revealing. And I was very curious to see if there was something else that could be done after you reveal this, like if there's some other thing that can be extracted out of this like composition, like some other hidden knowledge that you could acquire from yourself after this point. So I was left with that curiosity, like what could I learn now that I have this smell? Could that be made into another type of knowledge apart from this like experience? like maybe I could realize, I don't know, that was just in my mind after the experience. But I thought it was a very interesting bonding moment, to say the least.
Yes, I agree. And also because I heard your introduction talk where you already talked about your plant human monster babies. And I actually the thing I was yearning for was this kind of next step experience of the pheromones maybe being used for something other than just consuming them again. Because then it's just returning back to this human body instead of maybe going further. Yeah. So that was something I think is maybe an interesting step for you to like.
Right. Yeah.
My experience was that you invited us to do some very intense, very intimate practices with extreme delicacy and justesse in the tone. That was where the intensity lay, in the fact that we were driven into a space of deep discomfort, but it was held in such a way that it was it invited a whole different perspective on that. So I think that was just to sort of, it can sound a bit intense if it's just framed in that way. There were curtains for the measuring. And I think it's very interesting. One of the things that I took away was the tinkering aspect of science. There's this the laboratory space that we're invited into is one in which you're cooking the hormones and extracting, and there's something very low tech about this thing that has this very high tech kind of veneer, and there's a way in which the cycle, you're illustrating or shedding light on one moment in this sort of cycle of substances being produced in industry and transiting through our bodies and producing these effects via our very intimate sort of realities. And so that's a very powerful experience to be invited into. It's a very different thing to become aware of those multiple ramifications when one is reading a text in a newspaper, even when it's décalé, but when one experiences it through one's own sort of body in that way, it really pushes into a whole different realm of comprehension and potential to respond, I think. So.
Do you want to respond? Are there more comments?
Okay.
Also want to reiterate what a wonderful and intense experience it was. But one of the things I was thinking of, especially afterwards, was how this was not just a performative space, but very much a pedagogical space. And I was very interested in how you thought about the work of pedagogy there, especially in relation to, if we think of ourselves collectively as sort of critical interlocutors with techno-science, and we're sort of critical of the appropriative and the reductionist practices of much techno-science. And of course, the whole installation has scathing critiques of sort of corporatized techno-science and a whole series of, at the same time, the whole staging of this was a simulated laboratory environment, right? And so the ambivalent engagement to science, I thought, was very interesting, especially at this moment where even as we need to be critics of techno-science, we cannot afford to be critics of science, right? When all manner of other kinds of non-enlightenment fundamentalisms are taking root in our world. And so the sort of exploration of your own ambivalent relationship to a series of techno-scientific practices, for instance, a sort of anti-reductionism and an anti-corporatism, and yet at the heart of getting at this pheromonic essence is a practice of extraction, right, which is a fundamentally capitalist. And I was really interested in that ambivalence and what you were teaching us through that ambivalence.
Yes, exactly. I mean, this was kind of my point that, even before with my relationship to plants, there are some things that are just messy and you have to sort of accept and embrace that the fact that there is no exit. And yet within this situation, there are ways of like queering, if you like to use that term, or looking for recombinations, for multiplicities, for getting dirty otherwise than is prescribed. And that's kind of what we were hoping to also evoke. Well, portraying that even the knowledge itself contains a lot of paradoxes, controversies within itself, aside from the fact that the system that we are intervening, this endocrine disruption, it cannot be clearly understood. Essentially, it cannot be colonized because it doesn't work in that stable way, right? There's cocktail effects, there's unpredictability. And the fact that if you look at, if we return back to the semiotics, that these molecules coincidentally feed into our semiotic systems, or the semiotic system of the biosphere, and that the plastic, if you like, has a way of speaking to our bodies, like in ill communication right now, maybe in the future, that makes sense to us. I think that it's quite intriguing, and I'm wondering, instead of going this alarmist or a rejectionist route, which I don't necessarily think we can afford, I don't think that is an option, how can we possibly think about it in a way that does not make us anxious, paralyzed, and completely depressed?
Are there more comments, questions to the panel at this point? Yeah.
I had a question about scale, because scale was really present in all the presentations, and it's a huge stake in this question of how do we think about, the relationalities that stagger these scales. And I was thinking of Tsing's work on unscalability, or the non-scalable, and how making scale requires a lot of work. It's labor, it's at the core of the project of modernity and capital, and I don't know if she puts it in these terms, but outside of that labor of scalability, it wouldn't be natural, her category, but whatever exists before scalability is non-scalable. And so when, I'm always struggling with these concepts of scale, and how do I link these scales, the political, the microbial, the molecular, and yet as I try to think past that language, I'm sort of entrapped in the sort of rhetoric of scale. So I just wanted to sort of throw that out there and invite comments or a discussion around that problem.
Yeah, just briefly, yes, thank you for this comment. When I first started working in the field of art, that's one of the first things I came across, because even humanities and natural sciences are utterly irreconcilable. And coming from with a scientific mind, I thought there must be something, very fishy. There's something fishy about this. And then I came across Freeman Dyson's quotes about the scales of time, and how actually in order for us to continue living through, let's say, geological time, you have to be able to survive on these different scales, the scales of the cells in your body, the organism, the family, the tribe, if you like, a species, ecosystem, biosphere, okay? And that in order to survive, each of these scales can have a different principle, a different interest, a different drive, right? yet our bodies have to negotiate and survive on all these different timescales simultaneously, right? So he says at the end, I'm kind of badly quoting him, but of course we are conflicted because we are shaped by these conflicting demands of the different scales happening simultaneously. And for me, this was also kind of a relief because in order to, the fact that we cannot reconcile all of these is okay, you know, so that is, they can exist without us struggling with that so much.
Which is interesting, where we're sitting right now, I mean, it's a ballet space, right? So it's an ensemble of dancers. It's a group of mesoscopic bodies working in a radius of 2 by 2 meters and assembling in a kind of coordinated movement and so on. So when you go back to this, what it means in this scale that these guys have been working with and the issues that are macroscopic issues, I mean, this is interesting in how far alternative ways of knowledge transmission within this epistemological term become performances as such. And I mean, it's not a coincidence that, for example, the biohacking scene or activities that were proposed by the Hacketeria network, for example, or all these persons that reclaim for themselves an aesthetics of workshopology, right? I was introduced by Marc Dusselier to this term of workshopology, and artists actually trying to find ways of active bodily participation that combines different scales as a kind of practice. And these practices also contaminate more and more what performance art and what even dance is. And you see more and more dancers integrating non-human elements into the performances, such as mealworms eating plastic, styropor, where they are actually producing the soundscape of the performance while actually eating humans' waste away, or dancing with phytoplankton, or such as in Anyararo Daudo's works about distillation of migrative plants, of eucalyptus migrative species, and having olfactive stimulus that invades the body even at the molecular scale. So you have all these formats right now around, which is very interesting because we are here at PACT, which is actually a dance center, first and almost. So what is the future of dance? What is the future of performance? So I think that organizing this panel was hopefully helping a little bit to go beyond the scale up in which normally dance on this scene is usually happening. And it's really a very welcome initiative with this Blue Skies to open it up to atomized bodies and to think in a kind of scalable way what bodies, ecologies, the oikos at large might be, and even through the lens of performance and dance art to open this window. So I think we all want to thank you as organizers very much, and I think also I get a signal that we have to close this panel now. Thank you.